The room went dead silent. That's what they didn't know, that Margaret Walsh could stop a heart monitor with just a look, that her presence in a hallway made residents straighten their spines like soldiers at attention, that the woman in the faded scrubs with surgical scars running down her forearms had once led 17 operators through Kandahar province under sniper fire and brought all 17 back alive. They saw a middle-aged nurse with tired eyes and weathered hands. They didn't see the legend. They didn't see Captain Margaret Reaper Walsh, classified missing in action since 2009, the military file with her photograph marked deceased, the orders from Joint Special Operations Command stamped across every page, disappear, never surface, let the past stay buried. But the past has a way of walking through hospital doors at exactly the wrong moment. Margaret arrived at Riverside Community Hospital in Atlanta at 04:45, 20 minutes before her shift, the same routine she'd maintained for 15 years. The parking lot was empty except for one delivery truck backing toward the loading dock, its red taillights reflecting off wet asphalt. Rain had fallen all night. Her orthopedic shoes, practical, black, military-grade despite the civilian label, splashed through puddles without hesitation. She moved like someone accustomed to moving quietly. The ER entrance was still dark except for the motion sensor lights that flickered on as she approached, casting harsh fluorescent shadows across her face. Her badge read, M. Walsh, RN, Surgical ICU, 15 years of service. Nothing more. That was intentional. The ICU smelled like antiseptic and machine oil, that particular blend of institutional cleanliness that never quite masked the underneath, fear, sickness, the chemical scent of bodies in transition between living and not. Margaret moved through it like she was moving through a familiar geography, past room 312 where Mr. Cheng was extubating well, past room 318 where the new post-op from yesterday's bowel resection was finally stable, her eyes tracking monitors and 4 lines and the precise angles of ventilator settings with the kind of attention that made younger nurses nervous. She didn't ask permission to check orders. She didn't need to. The residents had learned long ago that when Nurse Walsh appeared with a question about a medication dosage or a lab value, you had better have an answer ready. At the central station, she logged into the computer with her security code, M.Walsh.7734, and began her systematic review of the night shift reports. 7 patients in the unit. 3 were stable. 2 were improving. 1 was deteriorating. 1 was new, admitted at 2,347 hours. Her eyes moved across the screen with the kind of mechanical efficiency that came from doing the same task 10,000 times. Vital signs. Medication lists. Allocation codes. Everything aligned and ordered, everything in its proper place. The fluorescent lights hummed above her head, a sound so constant she'd stopped hearing it years ago, the same way soldiers stop hearing the ambient noise of a forward operating base. It becomes the silence. Dr. Edmund Ashford arrived at 0630, and Margaret knew the exact moment he walked onto the unit because the energy changed. He was 39, Harvard Medical School, chief of surgery at Riverside for 4 years, the kind of surgeon who believed efficiency and profitability were the same thing. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a shine that reflected the ceiling lights. His white coat bore the weight of his rank like a uniform. He moved through the ICU with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no and didn't expect to start. Margaret continued documenting medications without looking up. She'd seen his pattern for months now, the subtle ones, the adjustments that never appeared as direct orders, the way he'd pause at the medication cart and make small suggestions about dosage optimization for patients without insurance coverage. Their kidneys seem overwhelmed. Maybe we reduce the antimicrobial burden, they'll likely be discharged within 48 hours anyway. That pain management protocol seems aggressive for someone with no income. Dial it back, let natural healing compensate. The words were always wrapped in medical reasoning, always plausible in isolation, but the pattern was unmistakable, the sickest uninsured patients got the least aggressive care. Margaret had started documenting everything. The exact times. The exact dosages. The exact names of patients who'd been transferred out and later readmitted with complications that should have been preventable. She didn't say anything about it. Not yet. The orders from Bagram had been explicit, and they were still the loudest voice in her head after 15 years. Keep your head down, don't surface, don't remind anyone that Captain Walsh exists. Making accusations, reporting patterns, inserting herself into bureaucratic battles, that was the opposite of disappearing. That was the opposite of survival. Dr. Ashford stopped at her station. Nurse Walsh, I need a word about room 315. The post-op's fluid balance isn't tracking. I'm concerned about infection. Margaret looked up, her face neutral. The patient's white count is actually improving. Down from 14.2 to 11.8. And the surgical site shows no signs of cellulitis. Temperature's been stable for 18 hours. Nevertheless, his voice carried the kind of smooth authority that made disagreement seem like insubordination. I'd like to see a more aggressive antibiotic protocol. Switch to meropenem. Higher dose. That's going to affect kidney function on a post-op. I'm aware of the pharmacodynamics, Nurse Walsh. He smiled, and it was the smile of someone who didn't understand that smiling while delivering an insult made the insult sharper. Just follow the order. She closed her mouth and nodded. Just a nurse. That was her identity now. That was the script she'd been given and the performance she'd maintained through 10,000 shifts, through 15 years of watching doctors make mistakes and patients pay the price, through holding it all together while keeping her hands still and her voice quiet and her past locked down tighter than any classified file in the Pentagon. The new admission in room 347 arrived at 0800, transferred from the emergency department with a transfer note that read like a summary of systemic failure, 62-year-old male, respiratory compromise, initial workup incomplete, family requesting admission despite low insurance coverage. The nurse helping with intake was Jennifer, young, efficient, already clearly overwhelmed by the workload. Margaret helped her arrange the monitors, the 4-pole, the ventilator setup. The patient was unconscious, his face slack against the pillow, his breathing shallow beneath the oxygen mask. Margaret's hands froze for exactly 1 second when she saw his face. Colonel Richard Vance. She knew that face. She knew the angle of his jaw, the grey at his temples, the way his left eye had a small scar at the corner from an IED briefing gone wrong at FOB Shank in Loga Province. She knew this face because she'd been court-martialed in a room with that face sitting at the table deciding her fate. She knew this face because it was the face that had destroyed her career, erased her identity, turned Captain Margaret Walsh into a ghost that officially died in 2009. The memory came back like something that had been waiting in her chest for 15 years, the briefing room, the classified operation that had gone wrong, the decision to bury it, the orders to bury her, the voice of this man saying, for operational security, Captain Walsh will be processed as KIA. Her existence on this mission never occurred. Her jaw tightened for exactly 1 moment. Then her expression went blank again, the mask dropped back into place like it had never lifted. Monitors showing some arrhythmia, Jennifer said, pointing to the EKG tracing. Should I notify Dr. Ashford? Not yet. Margaret's voice was steady, measured, betraying nothing. Let's get a full workup first. 12-lead EKG, troponin, BNP, complete metabolic panel. He's showing compensatory tachycardia. Could be pain, could be hypoxia, could be cardiac. We'll know more in 20 minutes. She moved with mechanical precision, her hands adjusting the oxygen, her eyes reading the monitors with the calm focus of someone who'd done this thousands of times. The past was not allowed to interrupt the present. That was the rule. That was survival. But then Dr. Ashford appeared in the doorway, and his eyes moved from the patient to Margaret, and something shifted in his expression, a calculation, an assessment, a moment of recognition that turned into something else. He studied her for a long moment, the way a predator studies prey that might be more interesting than it first appeared. Nurse Walsh. His voice was different now, tighter. A word outside, please. She followed him into the corridor, where the fluorescent lights cast their mechanical glow and the machines hummed their constant, mechanical song. Around them, the hospital moved in its organized chaos, beeping monitors, soft footsteps on linoleum, the distant overhead page calling for a code in the trauma bay. "How well do you know the new patient?" he asked. "I don't." "You look like you recognized him." Margaret's eyes met his, and for a moment her composure slipped just enough to show something underneath, not fear, but something harder, something that made Dr. Ashford take a small step back. "I look at a lot of patients, doctor. I remember what needs to be remembered. Everything else I forget." She turned to go back to room 347, but he spoke again, his voice lower now, almost conversational. "I've noticed you spend a lot of time reviewing medication protocols. Checking my orders. That's thorough of you." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The understanding was clear between them now. He knew she was watching. She knew what he'd been doing. And neither of them was going to acknowledge it directly because they were both professionals operating in an institutional system where the rules were written down but everyone understood the unwritten ones beneath them. At home that evening, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with her daughter, Emma, who was 12 and growing into an age where she asked the kinds of questions that required real answers. Emma was tall for her age, with her mother's dark hair and a curiosity that hadn't yet learned to be afraid of the answers it might find. "How was work, Mama?" Emma asked, stabbing at her pasta with the casual disinterest of someone whose biggest worry was the math test on Friday. "Good. Quiet. Did anything interesting happen?" Margaret took a bite of food she didn't taste. Her surgical scars caught the kitchen light as she lifted her fork, white puckered lines running from wrist to elbow on both arms, the kind of scars that came from shrapnel and blast radius and the terrible, specific violence of warfare. Emma had asked about them once, years ago, when she was young enough that her mother could say accident at the hospital and she'd accepted it without question. Now Emma knew better, or at least she knew that there was more to know, even if she didn't ask anymore. "Nothing interesting," Margaret said. "Just the usual. People getting better. People getting sicker. That's the job. Do you like it? Being a nurse?" Margaret looked at her daughter, this person who existed because of decisions made during a 24-hour leave in Germany, this person who was the only thing she'd managed to build in 15 years of trying to disappear. Emma was the opposite of classified. Emma was the opposite of buried. Emma was the one true thing that couldn't be redacted from the record. "I like helping people," Margaret said. "I'm good at it. And when you're good at something, it matters." Emma nodded like this made sense, like it was a complete explanation, and went back to her pasta. The kitchen light hummed above them, and outside the window, the Atlanta evening was darkening toward night, and Margaret knew that in room 347 of Riverside Community Hospital, her past was breathing through an oxygen mask and waiting to see if the present would allow it to continue. The morning shift at Riverside Community Hospital began like every other morning, the ER doors sliding open on worn tracks, the smell of antiseptic and brewing coffee mixing in the climate-controlled air, the soft percussion of shoe soles on polished tile. Margaret Walsh had learned long ago that hospitals were machines, and machines could be managed if you understood their rhythms. She understood them. She'd managed worse. Room 347 lay at the end of the east corridor, where the morning light cut through the windows in hard geometric shapes. Colonel Richard Vance was awake, his daughter and son-in-law sitting in the visitor chairs, their faces carrying that particular expression of people who'd spent the night listening to machines breathe for someone they loved. Margaret had seen that expression 10,000 times. She checked his vitals, oxygen saturation stable, blood pressure holding at 118/71, heart rate a steady 74 beats per minute. Everything documented in the chart with the precision of someone who'd spent 15 years keeping death from walking through locked doors. She was reaching for the 4 line when Dr. Ashford appeared in the doorway, his white coat pristine, his hands empty of anything resembling actual work. Behind him trailed 2 residents, fresh enough to still believe hierarchy was the same as competence. "Nurse Walsh." His voice carried the particular timbre of a man about to perform. "Let's discuss this charting discrepancy." Margaret's hand stilled. Not because of fear. Because of recognition. This was the moment. This was the move that came after the assessment, the way a hunter circles before the kill. She turned, her face neutral as a concrete wall. There is no discrepancy, doctor. But he was already moving into the room, gesturing for the residents to follow, making sure the family watched. He pulled her chart from the rack and held it up like evidence at trial, his finger stabbing at a line of vitals she'd recorded at 0600 hours, sinus rhythm, steady, normal, documented exactly as it had occurred. This notation here. He tapped the timestamp with the aggressive precision of a man who'd rehearsed the gesture. Violates Protocol 14C, subsection 3. The updated standards require, he paused, making sure the Colonel's daughter was watching. Making sure she understood that Nurse Walsh was the kind of person who cut corners. Who didn't read the standards? Who might be killing her father through negligence? Margaret's jaw tightened. Just a fraction. Just enough for her hands to know what her voice refused to say. I've read the standards, Doctor. 3 times. That timestamp is accurate. The notation is complete. There is no protocol violation. You're contradicting me in front of patients. His voice climbed half an octave, the voice of a man who'd just been handed the thing he needed. This is exactly the kind of insubordination that creates patient safety issues. The Colonel's son-in-law shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. The daughter leaned forward, suddenly afraid that the incompetent nurse was going to hurt her father. That was the genius of it. That was the machinery at work. Dr. Ashford wasn't trying to convince Margaret of anything. He was convincing them. He was building the story that made her departure inevitable. Margaret set down the fall line with the care she'd use with a loaded weapon. Her eyes met Ashford's, 2 shades of blue, one like winter ice, the other like shallow pretense. When you're done performing, Doctor, there are actual patients who need care. She didn't wait for his response. She turned and walked out of the room, her shoulders straight, her breathing controlled, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse things than a small man with a stethoscope and a vendetta. Behind her, she heard him say to the family, "We're addressing some competency issues with our nursing staff. It's a process." The break room at Riverside Community was rectangular, fluorescent lit, smelling of microwaved pasta and the particular resignation of people who'd chosen to spend their lives around suffering. At 1,300 hours, it was full, 6 nurses at the central table, another 3 by the coffee station, the orderly who'd worked the night shift reading his phone in the corner. Margaret sat down with her lunch, a Tupperware container of cold pasta she'd prepared Sunday evening, the kind of meal that required no thought and could be eaten while reviewing patient charts mentally, running through the next shift's priorities, staying one move ahead of crisis. She opened the container. Steam rose for a moment. The meal was colder than she'd expected. The first sign was the silence. Not gradual. Sudden. Like someone had turned off the sound. The 6 nurses at the central table rose in perfect synchronization. Margaret didn't look up, but she heard the push of chairs, the soft scrape of the table's feet on linoleum. She heard them file toward the door. She heard the silence of the coffee station. The orderly had already left. Nobody looked at her. Nobody said anything. It was coordinated with the precision of a military movement, which meant Ashford had organized it, had texted them, had made sure they understood that Nurse Walsh was no longer part of the tribe. Isolation was a strategy. Margaret understood strategies. She kept eating, her fork moving with mechanical precision, her eyes on the pasta, her mind already cataloguing what this meant. First, they'd isolated her socially. Second, they documented her for insubordination. Third, the public humiliation of being left alone while 6 colleagues filed out in orchestrated silence. Each move building on the previous one, constructing a narrative: Nurse Walsh is difficult, Nurse Walsh is unstable, Nurse Walsh is a liability. When the door swung shut, Margaret's voice cut through the silence like gravel under a tank. Cowards always travel in herds. She said it to the empty room. She said it to the fluorescent lights humming above her. She said it to herself, because that was the deal she'd made 15 years ago when she'd decided to disappear. She would stay calm. She would not defend herself. She would not make scenes that would draw attention. She would be the kind of invisible that kept secrets buried. but her hands had stopped moving. The pasta sat half-eaten. The fork lay still. Above her, the fluorescent bulb flickered in an irregular rhythm, like a dying heartbeat, and Margaret understood then that Dr. Ashford wasn't trying to break her through humiliation. He was trying to separate her from information. The ICU was where she'd been monitoring the medication discrepancies. The ICU was where she'd started putting the pieces together. The ICU was where Colonel Vance was, and she'd seen enough in his chart to know that he was next. She couldn't go back to being a ghost. Not when there was a man in room 347 who'd court-martialed Captain Margaret Walsh and buried her alive. Not when he was vulnerable. Not when the same person who destroyed her career was now destroying this hospital from the inside out, one uninsured patient at a time. That night, while the hospital settled into the rhythm of evening shifts and evening rounds, while Dr. Ashford was somewhere in his office crafting the next move in his orchestration, Margaret accessed the medication database from a workstation in the surgical prep area, dark at this hour, empty except for the low hum of sterilizers and the blue glow of monitor screens. The pattern crystallized immediately. Room 312, Mrs. Chen, admitted for pneumonia, prescribed 5 mg oxycodone every 4 hours, but the dispensary log showed 3 mg dispensed for the past 4 days. Room 319, Mr. Rodriguez, post-op shoulder repair, 10 mg morphine prescribed, 7 mg actually delivered. Room 347, Colonel Richard Vance, admitted with respiratory distress, prescribed pain management protocols, receiving 50% of the ordered doses. 23 patients over 6 weeks. A 2.3-day reduction in average hospital stays. An 18% improvement in reimbursement metrics for Ashford's unit. Her finger traced the screen, and she could see the mathematics of cruelty, the calculation that discomfort plus early discharge minus proper pain management equaled better hospital statistics and better numbers on whatever performance review determined his salary. She photographed the screen with her phone. The flash illuminated the empty room like lightning, and in that moment of brightness, she heard his voice. "You're not authorized in this area, Walsh." Dr. Ashford stood in the doorway with a security guard, his face carrying the expression of someone who'd just won the game he'd been playing since breakfast. Behind him, the corridors of Riverside community stretched away into darkness. "You're accessing patient records outside your assigned unit," he continued, his voice clipped and precise, every word chosen to ensure that what he was saying would be documented, would be unchallengeable. "That violates HIPAA Protocol 164.308. I'm documenting this as a patient confidentiality breach." Margaret set her phone down on the workstation keyboard with the same care she'd used lowering a weapon. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw something that made him step back half an inch, not fear, not anger, but the kind of clarity that comes from someone who'd already made peace with losing. "Document whatever you need to sleep at night, Doctor." She didn't resist when the security guard asked her to follow him. She didn't argue when they walked her to the employee services office. She didn't fight when they told her that effective immediately, pending a formal investigation, she was being transferred to overnight triage in the ER, 3 floors away from the ICU, 3 floors away from the medication records, 3 floors away from Colonel Richard Vance. Ashford had won the paperwork war. He'd separated her from the evidence and the witnesses in one surgical move. She was now officially a liability, a patient confidentiality risk, a nurse under investigation for accessing records she had no authorization to see. The cruelest part was that he was right about the paperwork. What he wasn't right about was understanding who he was standing next to. The write-up appeared on the main unit board at 0700, 3 pages long, typed in that clinical font that makes accusations look like policy. Fabricated medication discrepancies. Unauthorized access to restricted files. Failure to maintain professional boundaries. Dr. Ashford had been building this for 3 weeks, every incident report a brick, every witness statement a nail. Margaret read it without moving. Her eyes tracked the words but her face remained still, the kind of stillness that comes from someone trained to absorb incoming fire without flinching. Around her, nurses whispered. She felt their eyes. She didn't acknowledge them. At 0815, she found Ashford reviewing charts in the physician's alcove, that narrow space between the medication room and the supply closet where conversation stayed private. He looked up as she approached, and something flickered across his face, satisfaction, maybe, or the anticipation of a hunter watching prey walk into the trap. "That right up," Margaret said. Her voice was flat, clinical, the way a nurse discusses vital signs. "You've confused paperwork with competence again. No wonder your surgical outcomes need creative documentation." Ashford stood slowly. "You're accusing me of falsifying records." "I'm observing that your charting is immaculate," Margaret replied. "Your patient outcomes are questionable." "That's not accusation. That's pattern recognition. And you would know about patterns." His smile was thin. "You're the one accessing files you shouldn't touch, making enemies where you should be grateful for employment." She turned to leave. His voice followed her like a blade. "One more misstep, Walsh. That's all it takes." Margaret returned to the ER at 0900, but the ICU stayed in her peripheral vision like a second heartbeat. She knew what she'd seen in the medication database during her night research: dosages reduced by 40% for uninsured patients, systematically, methodically, deliberately accelerating their decline so they'd either recover quickly enough to be discharged or deteriorate enough to become someone else's problem. The data had been clean. Terrifyingly clean. A surgeon who knew exactly how much damage was profitable. The ER shift was routine: a sprained ankle, a migraine, a teenager with a fever that responded to fluids and rest. Margaret moved through the motions with mechanical precision, her hand steady while her mind mapped a different floor. 3 stories up. The ICU. Room 347. At 0300, during a quiet break where she sat in the staff break room with cold coffee and a phone that felt heavier than it should, she called the ICU charge nurse. The line picked up on the second ring. "ICU, this is Sarah speaking." "Sarah, it's Margaret Walsh. I'm calling about the patient in 347. Silence. Not the silence of someone thinking. The silence of someone recognizing a voice they'd been instructed to avoid. "You're not assigned to this unit," Sarah said finally. "Stop calling." The line went dead before Margaret could respond. She held the phone in her lap for 30 seconds, watching the screen go dark, understanding with crystalline clarity that Ashford had already anticipated this move. He'd already poisoned the well. She was radioactive now. Anyone who engaged with her risked becoming contaminated by association. But at 0400, when Margaret used the stairwell access to retrieve supplies from the third-floor stockroom, she took the long route. Past the ICU. Through the corridor where she could see into patient rooms through the double doors. Her eyes found room 347 almost automatically, muscle memory and protective instinct overriding every order she'd ever been given to disappear. Colonel Vance was sitting upright in bed, but his chest was moving too fast. In and out. In and out. Rapid. Laborde. His oxygen saturation monitor glowed from the wall, 88%, dropping toward 85. His lips had taken on a faint blue tinge. The characteristic pursing of someone struggling to draw enough air. Margaret's hand clenched into fists. She could see his medication cart from the doorway. It had the angle clearly visible, the bronchodilator bottle positioned at the front. She could read the label from 20 feet away because her eyes had been trained to read dosages from across rooms, to catch mistakes and corrections in a single glance. The dose was dangerously low. 40% reduction. Deliberate. Calculated. She approached the nearest ICU nurse, not Sarah, but a younger nurse named Michelle who'd been kind during the morning rounds a week ago. "His respiratory rate is climbing," Margaret said quietly. "Oxygen saturation dropping. Has anyone called the attending?" Michelle's face went white. She glanced over her shoulder at the nurse's station, where Sarah was visible at the computer. Dr. Ashford gave specific orders. "You need to leave this floor." "What kind of orders?" "The kind that say if you come up here again, he's calling security." Margaret's jaw tightened. Not a flinch. Not a reaction. Just the subtle contraction of muscle that happens when someone absorbs bad news and calculates the cost. She turned and walked back to the ER, her trauma shears feeling heavier in her pocket than they had an hour before. The ER stayed manageable until 0600. Then her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She recognized the message anyway. It came through with the signature of someone risking their job to send it. One of the ICU nurses. Not Sarah. Someone braver. Vance crashing. No doctor responding. Margaret read the text 3 times. The 4th time, she was already moving. She abandoned her current patient, a woman with a dislocated shoulder who was stable and waiting for x-rays, and walked to the stairwell at a pace just under a run. Not fast enough to draw attention. Fast enough to matter. The stairs were empty. For flights. Her boots echoed on the metal steps. Tark, 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 tark. A rhythm like a countdown. She could feel her heartbeat responding, that old familiar acceleration that came before operations in Bagram. The moment before the helicopter landed and the mission started. The moment before certainty became chaos. She emerged on the 3rd floor at a dead sprint. The ICU doors pushed open with the sound of hydraulics and stale air. The hallway stretched in front of her like a corridor in a nightmare, too long, too bright, the fluorescent lights bleaching all color from the world. She could hear the alarm already. The monitor in room 347 singing its warning song. High-pitched. Insistent. The sound of a body failing. Dr. Ashford stood at the nurse's station, phone pressed against his ear, his free hand already gesturing as he spoke. Calling security. Already dialing. His eyes met hers as she moved past him toward Vance's room, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. Recognition. He'd anticipated this. He'd been counting on it. This was the final piece. The abandonment of her assigned post. The violation of the suspension order he'd crafted so carefully. Margaret's hands moved as she entered the room. Muscle memory took over. Trauma shears from her pocket, the ones engraved with Reaper that she'd never been able to discard, that she kept sharp and clean and ready for moments exactly like this. Colonel Vance's oxygen saturation was 81% now. His chest heaving. His eyes wide with the panic that comes from not being able to breathe. His mouth opening and closing silently, his lungs screaming for air they couldn't process through the narrowing of his airway. I need a 14-gauge angiocath, Margaret said. Her voice was ice. Command voice. The voice of someone who'd given orders in languages that didn't have gentle ways to say things. Oxygen set to 15 liters. Get me the emergency cart. Nobody moved. The room was frozen, captured in that second before chaos crystallizes into action. Now, she said. And the ICU exploded into motion. The monitors screamed before Margaret reached room 347. Oxygen saturation 72%. Dropping. The ventilator's wheeze became a strangled gasp as Colonel Vance's body convulsed against the bed rails, his face darkening to purple. 2 junior nurses stood frozen at the bedside, eyes wide, mouths open, hands useless at their sides. One of them was paging overhead, voice trembling, code blue, ICU, code blue, but the words came out hollow, ritualistic, like prayers to a god who wasn't listening. It was shift change. The attending physician was somewhere between hospital and home, 16 minutes away at best. Margaret took 3 seconds to assess the damage. Vance's airway was completely obstructed. She could see the blockage immediately, a catastrophic swelling of the laryngeal tissue that no amount of oxygen could bypass. His lungs were screaming for air he couldn't get. His saturation plummeted, 68, 65, 63. The monitors didn't scream anymore. They wailed. Bag him. Now, Margaret commanded, her voice dropping into a register the junior nurses had never heard before, not a request, not a plea. An order. The kind of voice that assumed compliance because it came from someone accustomed to being obeyed. One of the nurses unfroze, grabbed the manual ventilation bag, began pushing oxygen into a non-functional airway. Useless. But it gave Margaret the 3 seconds she needed. She reached into her scrub pocket and pulled out the trauma shears. Stainless steel, compact, built for field work in conditions where you couldn't wait for proper equipment. The handle was worn smooth from 15 years of carrying, 15 years of never being able to discard them because some part of her, the part that refused to disappear completely, insisted on keeping them close. Engraved into the metal, Reaper. Letters she'd worn like a second heartbeat through anatomy classes and orientation videos and 1,000 shifts where she was just Margaret the nurse, just another body in a hospital gown that smelled like bleach and resignation. Not today. Her hands moved with the fluid precision of muscle memory so old it lived deeper than thought. She tilted Vance's head back, located the cricothyroid membrane by touch alone, the small notch between the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid, the one place where you could cut directly into the airway without destroying the vocal cords. Her fingers found it like they were searching for it in a sandstorm in Cunha province, like they'd done this 1,000 times in 100 dark tents with rounds coming in and soldiers bleeding out and no time for protocol. The first cut was swift. Clean. Muscle and membrane parting like paper. Blood sprayed her scrubs. The smell of it, copper and salt and something deeper, something that belonged to the operating theater of life or death, filled the air. She didn't hesitate, didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge the nurse's sharp intakes of breath. Her hands were already moving to the second cut, deepening the opening, creating a window into the trachea. The tissue was slick now, bleeding profusely, but her hands were steady as surgical steel. Tube. For .0, she said, and Sarah Chen, the same ICU nurse who'd walked out of the break room days ago, who'd participated in Ashford's orchestrated silence, thrust a pediatric endotracheal tube into her palm without question. That tone. That voice. Some part of Sarah's brain recognized it as the sound of someone who had done this before, who had done harder things, who would not accept failure. Margaret guided the tube through the opening she'd created, through the cricothyrotomy membrane, directly into Vance's trachea. The tube seated with a soft click. Immediately, instantly, the manual ventilation bag began to work. Air actually entered his lungs now. His chest rose. The monitors shifted from wail to urgent beeping, and that was better, that was progress. 65. 70. 75. Margaret secured the tube with tape, her movements automatic, practiced, the kind of precision that only comes from having done something in conditions where mistakes meant caskets instead of recoveries. 82. 86. 92% oxygen saturation. Vance's body stopped convulsing. His face began to shift from purple back toward its normal color, the desperation draining from his features. His eyes fluttered once, unfocused, searching, and for a fraction of a second they found her face. Something flickered across his expression, confusion, maybe, or the ghost of recognition, before his consciousness slipped away again and he was just a patient in a hospital bed, breathing, alive, the crisis suspended in the past tense. Margaret stepped back from the bed. Her scrubs were soaked in blood. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, not from the weight of what she'd done, but from the sheer biological fact of adrenaline coursing through her system, the body's way of reminding itself that it had just survived something. She steadied her breathing, pressed her hands together, and looked at the 2 junior nurses staring at her like she'd performed resurrection instead of an emergency surgical procedure. His tube needs to be sutured to his face to prevent displacement, she said calmly, as if she hadn't just violated every protocol in the Joint Commission manual, as if she wasn't suspended, as if she had any right to be giving orders. Sarah, call radiology. We need a chest X-ray to confirm tube placement. Get a stat ABG. Continuous pulse ox monitoring. I want blood work drawn, CBC, CMP, lactate. Someone need to call his physician and report status change. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came exactly 20 minutes later when Dr. Ashford's shadow fell across the doorway of room 347. He wasn't alone. He never was. The hospital administrator followed him like a remora, and behind them came two security guards whose presence transformed the ICU into something other than a hospital, transformed it into a courtroom where the verdict was already written. Ashford carried a folder. His face wore an expression of practiced regret, the kind of expression that had probably taken him hours in front of a mirror to perfect. His power source, the meticulously documented 3-week paper trail of incident reports, the fabricated medication discrepancies, the policy violation notices that had magically appeared after Margaret's suspension, the witness statements he'd carefully cultivated from staff he'd either intimidated or bribed, all of it was inside that folder. He'd built a case so clean, so legally bulletproof, that the hospital board couldn't have prevented this termination even if they'd wanted to. "Margaret," Ashford said, his voice pitched perfectly between disappointment and administrative duty, "we need to speak with you in the hallway." She followed them without protest. In the hallway outside room 347, with Colonel Vance unconscious behind closed doors and monitors still beeping their steady rhythm of survival, Ashford opened the folder. "You have violated Joint Commission Protocol 47B, which explicitly prohibits nurses from performing surgical airways without physician oversight," he began, reading from the document with the kind of ceremonial cadence usually reserved for death pronouncements. "You abandoned your assigned post in the emergency department, leaving patients without coverage. You accessed a patient outside your assigned care area against explicit institutional directive." He looked up at her now, and she could see the satisfaction in his eyes, the gleam of a hunter who'd finally run his prey to ground. "Additionally, your actions today constitute gross insubordination and flagrant violation of the suspension order issued prior to this shift." Margaret said nothing. She was listening to the way the fluorescent lights above them hummed their high-frequency song, the way the hospital's cardiovascular system pumped around them through 4 lines and ventilators, and the steady tidal breath of human beings trying to stay alive another day. "This folder contains documentation of your pattern of misconduct," the administrator added, though Ashford had clearly prepared him to deliver this particular line. "The hospital board has reviewed the materials, and your employment is terminated effective immediately." He handed her an envelope. "You'll find the details in this letter, along with information regarding your final paycheck and the loss of your health insurance benefits." Ashford's smile was thin, surgical, precise. He'd won. He'd positioned her perfectly, disgraced her publicly, isolated her from her colleagues, built an airtight case, and now he was firing her for the exact act that had just saved Colonel Richard Vance's life. The symmetry was almost beautiful in its cruelty. "Security will escort you to your locker to collect your belongings," the administrator continued, nodding to the guards. "You are no longer authorized in this facility." Margaret looked at them, these small men with their small power, their ability to revoke badges and terminate employment and erase people from the places they'd poured themselves into. She looked at Ashford's satisfied expression. She looked at the termination letter in her hand. And she thought about the order. The one in a locked file in Bagram. "Captain Margaret Walsh is declared KIA. Disappear. Never surface. Never remind anyone that Operation Graveyard existed." 15 years of obedience. 15 years of swallowing her identity, of being just a nurse, of accepting condescension and humiliation because resistance would raise questions she'd been commanded to never answer. She could fight this. She could explain. She could pull the trauma shears from her pocket and show them the call sign engraved in the steel, could explain what her hands had been trained to do, could speak the truth about who she was and what she'd accomplished before the military had ordered her to disappear. Instead, she said nothing at all. She surrendered her badge to the security guard without protest. She walked through the ICU one final time, past Sarah Chen's shocked expression, past the board that still displayed her fabricated write-up, past the life she'd built from ashes and lies and the relentless commitment to being someone other than herself. In the parking lot, she sat in her car for 43 minutes before she could make her hands move to the ignition. The steering wheel felt strange under her palms, as if her body had forgotten how to be an ordinary person doing an ordinary thing. Rain began to fall, gentle at first, then harder, hammering against the windshield like applause for a performance that was finally over. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the trauma shears. The Reaper call sign caught the pale afternoon light filtering through the rain-soaked windows. For 15 years these shears had been a secret, a contradiction, a piece of who she was that could never be reconciled with who she pretended to be. 15 years of carrying them because some part of her, the part that had saved Colonel Vance's life, refused to disappear completely, refused to let go of the only proof that Captain Margaret Walsh had ever existed at all. She held them in her palm, watching the light play across the engraved letters, and made no decision about anything because the time for decisions had already passed. The rain fell. Her hands remained steady. And somewhere above the parking lot, in room 347, Colonel Richard Vance breathed through an airway his murderer had created, his lungs drawing oxygen through a surgical technique performed by the ghost of a woman the government had officially declared dead. 3 days later, Margaret stood in the parking lot of Riverside Community Hospital, her personal belongings in a cardboard box, and realized the building had become a cathedral of witnesses. The lobby doors burst open as she approached, and the hallway transformed into something between a courtroom and a theater. News cameras lined the entrance like predators sensing blood. Hospital staff filled the waiting area, not gathered casually, but arranged, orchestrated by Dr. Ashford's final play for institutional control. He'd called them all in, hoping their presence would reinforce the narrative of his righteousness, protocol enforcement, the noble doctor protecting standards. Margaret moved through the crowd like water finding its level, unremarkable, invisible, which was exactly how she'd learned to exist in rooms that didn't know what they were looking at. Then Colonel Richard Vance stood up from a wheelchair near the information desk, still in his hospital gown, his breathing still labored 3 days post-cricothyrotomy. His hand gripped the armrest and he pulled himself upright with the slow precision of a man reassembling himself from catastrophic damage. The lobby quieted the way a forest quiets when apex predators enter. His eyes locked onto Margaret's across the 50-foot expanse of tile and fluorescent hum and held her in their gravity like a tractor beam. His throat moved, swallowing, the scar tissue from her surgical airway visible above his collarbone like a brand. When he spoke, his voice came out rasped, fractured, but unmistakable, Reaper. That single word detonated everything. Margaret's daughter Emma emerged from behind a pillar, trembling visibly, and stepped forward in the silence. The girl's voice shook as she spoke into the microphone a hospital administrator hastily extended, "My mother is Captain Margaret Walsh." The fluorescent light seemed to hum louder, or perhaps that was just the sound of institutional certainty collapsing. A nurse Margaret recognized from the ICU, the one who'd spoken kindly during the isolation, read aloud from what appeared to be Vance's military file, Special Forces Officer, declared killed in action, 2009, Cunha Province. Classified operations. Dishonorable discharge proceedings initiated 2007, later sealed. The words hung in the recycled air like shrapnel still settling. A SEAL team leader in dress uniform, his uniform so precisely creased it looked like blue origami, stood from the back row and approached Margaret with the gait of someone crossing sacred ground. When he spoke, each medal was its own sentence, each one a hammer strike, Bronze Star for leadership under fire. Silver Star for direct action that saved 12 Allied soldiers. 2 Purple Hearts from separate engagement dates. And the JSOC Commendation for Operation Graveyard, 2009, an operation that saved 247 Afghan civilians during a compound assault that was officially never declassified until today. He paused, and the pause itself was a sound, the sound of careers ending and truths erupting from sealed vaults. An FBI deputy director stepped forward, his badge catching the light like a warning, Operation Graveyard has just been declassified at the Pentagon's direction. Captain Walsh's mission integrity and tactical excellence are now public record. The officer who ordered her erasure has already resigned. He looked directly at Dr. Ashford, as have 2 senior military commanders complicit in the original cover-up. Dr. Ashford's face drained of color the way a bathtub drains, all the blood rushing downward, leaving his skin the color of old hospital walls. His hands began moving, defensive gestures, reaching for explanations that wouldn't come. A 2-star general in full uniform, his chest decorated with ribbons that told stories of wars most people would never understand, stepped directly in front of him. The general's voice emerged low, controlled, the voice of someone who'd learned decades ago that power doesn't require volume, Dr. Robert Ashford. You are hereby terminated, effective immediately, for dismissing a decorated Special Forces officer and impeding her medical treatment. Clear your office. These cameras will document your exit. It wasn't a request. It was a command, the kind issued on battlefields, in operation centers, in moments when institutional failure became undeniable. The hospital board's attorney appeared as if summoned, serving Ashford with termination papers that looked like they could cut glass. His hands fumbled with the documents. His mouth opened and closed without sound. The news cameras captured every second, the precise moment when a man built entirely from institutional authority found that authority crumbling like old concrete. Within minutes, security escorted him toward the elevators. The lobby erupted, phones ringing, reporters shouting questions, staff members suddenly finding their courage now that the predator had been identified and marked. Margaret stood motionless through it all, her composure absolute, her expression unchanged, not because she felt nothing, but because she'd learned long ago that feeling everything and showing nothing was its own kind of strength. 6 months later, Margaret walked past a strip mall on Atlanta's east side, her new chief nursing officer uniform crisp against her skin, her trauma shears hanging proudly from her lanyard. The stainless steel caught the autumn sunlight and threw it back, the engraved letters Reaper gleaming like a declaration. Through the smudged window of an insurance brokerage, she saw him, Dr. Robert Ashford, sitting at a folding table under a faded banner that read Premium Insurance Solutions, now hiring, in letters that looked like they'd been printed 5 years ago and never updated. He held a phone to his ear, reading from a script, his posture collapsed inward like a building imploding into itself. His suit was rumpled. His eyes had lost the surgical precision they'd once held. Cold calling strangers for insurance policies, a man whose entire existence had depended on institutional hierarchy, now existing in the basement of the service economy, one rejection call away from complete invisibility. Their eyes met through the glass. A moment passed between them, measured in heartbeats. Margaret didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She didn't perform victory. She simply nodded once, acknowledgement, not forgiveness, but the recognition of consequences finally aligning with choices, and continued walking. The Atlanta VA hospital's entrance rose before her like a promise. Inside, she led morning rounds with 12 nurses, teaching them trauma protocols pulled directly from her classified past, airway management under fire, hemorrhage control in austere environments, triage decisions made in seconds that determined who lived and who didn't. A young veteran, double amputee from an IED blast in Kandahar province, panicked during a routine wound dressing change, his breathing accelerating, his hands shaking, the trauma rising up through his nervous system like floodwater. Margaret pulled up a chair beside him, rolled up her sleeve to show the scars on her forearm, old shrapnel wounds, surgical marks, the topography of survival, and told him about Cuna province and the long road back from when your body has been fractured by war. She told him about the difference between pain and information. She told him that breathing through it was possible. The veteran's pupils dilated with recognition. He was looking at someone who'd been broken and had reassembled herself into something functional, something purposeful. His breathing slowed. His hands steadied. Later that afternoon, in Margaret's office with its walls covered in commendation letters finally unhidden, Colonel Richard Vance appeared in the doorway. He walked without assistance now, the surgical airway fully healed, his voice restored to something approaching its original timbre. "Captain Walsh. May I come in?" She gestured to the chair across her desk. They sat in silence for the kind of long moment that only two people who'd nearly killed each other in their own ways could sustain. Outside, Atlanta's traffic hummed like a distant machine. Finally, Vance spoke. "I was wrong. In Bagram. I was ordered to bury Operation Graveyard, and I buried you with it. I've spent 15 years knowing what I did to you, what I chose to do, and I've never found the words to." Margaret's voice cut across his, steady and without malice. "You taught me something important, Colonel. Power isn't a title. Power is the ability to help. I've helped more people in 15 years as a nurse than I ever did as a captain." He nodded, tears tracing the lines of his face. "For what it's worth, you saved my life even after what I did to you." She stood, extended her hand across the desk. "That's the job, sir. We save people. Even when it costs us everything." They shook. He saluted, a formal gesture, precise and respectful. She returned it, and in that exchange, something released, something that had been locked since 2007 finally found a door. As Vance left, Emma appeared, Margaret's daughter carrying her mother's trauma shears, the metal gleaming like evidence. The girl turned them over in her hands with the careful reverence of someone holding something sacred. "Mama, what does Reaper mean?" Emma asked. Margaret took the shears, felt their familiar weight, clipped them back to her lanyard where they belonged. "It means I was really good at keeping people alive, baby. Come on. I'll show you how we do that here." They walked together into the ward, Margaret's past and present finally unified, the scars on her arms no longer something to hide but proof of battle survived and a calling that had never required permission or recognition to justify itself. The trauma shears hung from her neck like a medal earned through silence and competence, through 15 years of helping people quietly, through choosing to heal instead of hide. In the hallway, a resident asked her a question about sepsis protocol. She answered without hesitation, her voice commanding the room with the quiet authority of someone who'd learned the difference between power and authority. She was a nurse. She was a captain. She was both and neither, finally whole. If you've ever felt invisible while doing work that mattered, if you've ever watched someone dismiss what they didn't understand about you, subscribe to this channel. Like this video and comment, what would you have done in Margaret's position? Would you have saved him, or walked away?